Behind the towering stone walls of Balmoral, a decision was made that would ripple through the monarchy like a silent earthquake. No announcement, no warning. Just a single, decisive move by King Charles I that placed Catherine at the centre of royal power while quietly pushing Camilla to the margins. But what truly stunned insiders wasn't just the transfer, it was who was deliberately left out and why. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What unfolded behind closed doors was not chaos, but something far more unsettling: precision. A decision executed with such calculated silence that even those closest to the inner workings of the palace found themselves scrambling to understand it after the fact. There had been no gradual hints, no public signals, no carefully managed leaks to prepare the ground. Instead, the authority over Balmoral, an estate deeply tied to identity, memory, and control, shifted hands in a way that felt almost surgical. And at the center of it stood Catherine, not as a symbolic figure, but as the newly entrusted force behind its operational command. For years, Balmoral had represented more than land. It was a private kingdom within the monarchy, a space where influence was not displayed, but quietly exercised. And now, that influence had been redirected. Catherine's role was not introduced with fanfare, nor was it framed as a bold new era. It arrived quietly, almost deceptively so, as though its true weight was meant to be understood only by those paying close attention. And those who were immediately recognized the shift for what it was: a transfer of trust, of control, of future power. But what made this moment impossible to ignore was not just Catherine's rise, it was Camilla's absence, not a delayed involvement, not a secondary role. An absence. Reports began to circulate in hushed tones, describing a process that moved forward without her voice, without her input, without even the courtesy of inclusion. For someone long positioned at the heart of Charles's world, this wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. And in a system where every detail is intentional, the lack of her presence spoke louder than any official statement ever could. Inside palace corridors, the reaction was not loud, but it was immediate. Confusion gave way to speculation, and speculation quickly turned into something sharper: realization. This was not an administrative adjustment. It was a message about direction, about loyalty, about who would carry weight moving forward, and who would quietly feel that weight slipping away. Even those who had witnessed decades of royal shifts sensed something different this time, something deeper, something more deliberate. Because when power moves in silence, it rarely does so without purpose, and the precision of this decision suggested that it had been planned, considered, and held back until the exact right moment. The timing raised questions, the execution raised more, and the lack of resistance, at least publicly, only added another layer to the unfolding tension. It created a vacuum where answers should have been, and in that vacuum, narratives began to form. What made it even more striking was Catherine's response, or rather, the absence of one. There was no visible hesitation, no sign of surprise, no attempt to deflect the weight of what had just been placed in her hands. If anything, her quiet acceptance seemed to confirm what some had long suspected, that this moment had been anticipated, perhaps even prepared for, long before it became visible to the outside world. And if that was true, then this wasn't just a sudden decision, it was the final move in something much larger. And as the realization settled in, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about Balmoral, it was about positioning, about trust being reassigned in a way that would shape not just the present, but the future. A future where roles were no longer defined by tradition alone, but by something far more strategic, far more controlled. And as quiet as it all seemed on the surface, beneath it, everything had already begun to shift. But this wasn't a spontaneous decision born overnight, it had been quietly building, layer by layer, long before anyone realized what was at stake. Balmoral is not just an estate, it is the emotional heartbeat of the royal family. A place where power softens into tradition and secrets linger in the shadows of its forests. For generations it has been fiercely protected, carefully managed, and deeply personal. So when control of Balmoral changes hands, it's never just about land, it's about legacy, and this time that legacy took a sharply unexpected turn. To understand the weight of what has just happened, you have to understand what Balmoral truly represents. This is not simply a residence tucked away from public life. It is where the monarchy breathes differently, where decisions are not performed but felt, where influence is measured not by titles but by proximity and trust. For decades, control over Balmoral has never been handed lightly. It has remained within a carefully guarded inner circle, passed only to those who were seen not just as capable, but as deeply aligned with the Crown's private identity. And that is what makes this shift so profoundly unsettling. Because within those walls, authority is never just administrative, it is symbolic. Every decision tied to Balmoral carries emotional weight, reflecting who is trusted with the Monarchy's most personal space. It reveals alliances that are never spoken publicly. It exposes loyalties that cannot be easily explained. And now, with Catherine stepping into this role, those unspoken dynamics are no longer hidden, they are quietly, unmistakably changing. What once felt stable now feels recalibrated. For years, there had been an unspoken assumption about who would naturally hold influence over Balmoral's future. Camilla, positioned closely beside Charles, was widely seen as an integral part of that inner framework. Not because it was declared, but because it made sense within the structure that had been carefully observed over time. Her proximity suggested inclusion. Her presence implied trust. And yet, when the moment came, that expectation did not materialize. Instead, it dissolved quietly, but completely. And that absence did more than raise eyebrows. It disrupted a narrative that many believed was already written. Because if Balmoral is about trust, then this decision was not just about who was chosen, it was about who was not. And in that distinction lies the true weight of what has unfolded. It suggests that something deeper has shifted beneath the surface, something that goes beyond roles and titles and reaches into the very core of personal alignment and long-term vision. At the same time, Charles' connection to Balmoral cannot be ignored. This is a place tied to memory, to reflection, to identity. Every decision connected to it is layered with emotion, shaped by years of private moments that the public will never fully understand. So when he made this choice, it was not simply strategic, it was personal. And that makes it even more revealing, because personal decisions, especially within the monarchy, often signal truths that formal statements never will. Then comes Catherine, unexpected, yet somehow not entirely surprising. Her rise within this space challenges assumptions that had long gone unquestioned. She was never the obvious choice in the traditional sense, yet her presence now feels deliberate, almost inevitable. It speaks to a different kind of influence, one built quietly over time, strengthened not by demand, but by consistency. And in a place like Balmoral, where trust is everything, that kind of influence carries more weight than any title ever could. What this creates is not open conflict, but something far more complex, a silent battleground, where influence shifts without confrontation, where power is redefined without declaration. And in that silence, every move becomes more significant, every absence more telling, every decision more revealing. Because Balmoral does not just reflect the monarchy as it is, it reveals what it is becoming. And at the center of this shift stood Catherine, calm, composed, but suddenly holding a level of influence few had ever imagined. Catherine never demanded power, she absorbed it. Slowly, quietly. While others fought for influence in the open, she built something far more dangerous. Trust. And when King Charles made his move, it wasn't impulsive. It was the culmination of years of silent observation. But what did Charles see in Catherine that made him hand over something so deeply personal? And why now? The answer does not lie in a single moment, but in a pattern, one that unfolded gradually, almost invisibly, over time. Catherine did not rise through dramatic declarations or visible ambition. She moved differently. Where others asserted, she listened. Where others pushed forward, she held back. And in that restraint, something powerful began to take shape, because in an institution where every word is measured and every gesture is scrutinized, consistency becomes currency. And Catherine, more than anyone, understood how to spend it wisely. Her reputation was not built overnight. It was formed in quiet rooms, in controlled conversations, in moments where stability mattered more than spectacle. She became known not for what she said publicly, but for how she handled what the public never saw. Discretion became her signature, loyalty her foundation. And over time, those qualities did something subtle but significant. They created reliability, the kind of reliability that does not demand attention, but inevitably earns it. And Charles noticed, not in a sudden realization, but through accumulation. Decision after decision, moment after moment, he began to lean slightly at first, then more noticeably toward Catherine's judgment. It wasn't announced, it wasn't formalized, but within the inner workings of the monarchy, these shifts are rarely declared. They are felt, and those paying close attention began to recognize a pattern. When stability was needed, when clarity mattered, when discretion was essential, Catherine was there. What made this even more compelling was how effortlessly she avoided the appearance of ambition. There was no visible hunger for influence, no attempt to reshape her role in ways that drew attention, and yet her position continued to strengthen. Not because she reached for it, but because it was gradually placed in her hands. This is what made her rise so effective, and perhaps so unsettling to some. It wasn't forceful, it was inevitable. In contrast, the dynamics around her began to shift. Others within the palace operated with different energies, more visible, more assertive, more defined by presence. But Catherine's approach created a different kind of impact, one that was quieter, but far more enduring. She became not just a participant in the system, but a stabilizing force within it. And in a structure that values continuity above all else, that kind of presence becomes invaluable. There were also signs, subtle, easy to overlook at the time, that this moment had been building: increased involvement in sensitive responsibilities, greater proximity to key decisions, a growing sense that she was being trusted with matters that extended beyond her formal role. None of it was dramatic, none of it was obvious, but together they formed a trajectory, one that pointed directly to where she stands now. And when the moment finally arrived, when Balmoral was placed under her influence, there was no hesitation, no visible adjustment, just acceptance, calm, controlled, and absolute. Because for Catherine, this wasn't a sudden elevation, it was the continuation of something already in motion, a role she had been stepping into long before it was ever defined. Which is what makes this shift so significant. It wasn't just about capability, it was about trust, carefully built and deliberately rewarded. And in that trust lies the true power of this decision. Not loud, not obvious, but undeniable. But as Catherine stepped forward, another figure was left standing in the shadows, watching, waiting, and perhaps realizing what had just been taken away. There was no confrontation, no public disagreement, just silence. And sometimes, silence speaks louder than anything else. Camilla, long seen as Charles's closest ally, found herself on the outside of a decision she would have once been central to. No consultation, no input, just absence. And within palace walls, that absence began to feel less like oversight and more like intention. At first, it was difficult to grasp, not because the decision itself lacked clarity, but because of what it quietly implied. Camilla had long been positioned at the heart of Charles's world, her presence steady, her role seemingly secure, her influence assumed rather than questioned. For years, she had moved within the same inner orbit, where decisions of significance were rarely made without at least her awareness, if not her involvement. And yet, this time, something had changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but undeniably. The realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded in fragments, missed conversations, unshared discussions, decisions already finalized before they could be influenced. It wasn't exclusion in the loud, obvious sense. It was something far more controlled. A quiet distancing, a subtle repositioning that left no room for confrontation, but plenty of space for interpretation. And within that space, questions began to take shape. Why was she not included? Why now? And perhaps most unsettling of all, how long had this shift been underway without anyone fully noticing? Inside the palace, those attuned to its rhythms began to sense the difference, not through direct statements, but through tone, through absence, through the way certain conversations no longer circled back to the same voices. Charles' inner circle, once predictable in its composition, now felt altered. Smaller, more selective, And in that selectivity, a new pattern was emerging, one that no longer placed Camilla at its center. Yet outwardly, nothing broke. No visible reaction, no disruption of composure. Camilla remained as she always had, measured, controlled, composed, but that composure, rather than settling the situation, only deepened the tension. Because in a structure where emotion is rarely displayed, restraint becomes its own form of expression, and her silence, much like the silence surrounding the decision itself, carried weight. It suggested awareness, it hinted at understanding, but it revealed nothing. And that is what made this moment so complex. There was no clear conflict to point to, no moment of rupture that could be easily defined. Instead, there was a shift, gradual, deliberate, and deeply personal. One that did not need to be explained to be felt, because in an environment built on hierarchy and proximity, being left out is never neutral. It is always meaningful, always intentional. For those watching closely, the exclusion began to take on a symbolic dimension. It wasn't just about Balmoral. It wasn't even just about Catherine's rise. It was about a recalibration of trust, about who was being drawn closer and who was being quietly moved aside. And that kind of recalibration does not happen without reason. It reflects decisions that have been weighed carefully, shaped by factors that remain hidden but are no less real. What makes it even more striking is the contrast between expectation and reality. The assumption had always been continuity, that roles would evolve, that relationships would remain intact, that influence would expand, not contract. But this decision challenged that assumption in a way that could not be ignored. It introduced uncertainty where there had once been clarity. And in doing so, it forced a new question into the conversation. What else might be changing beneath the surface? Because when silence replaces inclusion, it rarely marks the end of something. More often, it signals the beginning of something else, something still forming, still unfolding, still not fully visible. And as this quiet shift continues to ripple outward, its true implications are only just beginning to emerge. Because this wasn't just about Balmoral, it was about something much bigger, something that had been quietly reshaping the monarchy itself. What looked like a single decision was, in reality, part of a much larger transformation. The monarchy wasn't just evolving, it was being carefully repositioned. And, at the heart of that repositioning stood Catherine, representing a future that felt controlled, modern, and stable. But every shift in power creates tension, and not everyone inside the palace was ready to accept what this new order meant. Because the transfer of Balmoral was never isolated, it was a signal, quiet, precise, but unmistakable. A signal that something deeper was underway, something that extended far beyond one estate or one role. Those who understood the inner mechanics of the monarchy recognized it immediately. This was not a reaction, it was a strategy, a calculated move designed to reshape not just responsibilities, but the very structure of influence itself. For years, the monarchy has existed in a delicate balance between tradition and adaptation. Too much change risks instability. Too little invites irrelevance. And within that tension lies the challenge every monarch faces: how to evolve without appearing to abandon the very foundations that define the institution. What Charles appears to have done here is something far more subtle. Instead of announcing change, he has embedded it, quietly, gradually, in ways that only become visible once they are already in motion. Catherine's emergence as a central figure is not accidental, it is strategic alignment. She represents continuity without controversy, strength without disruption, presence without unpredictability. In many ways, she embodies the version of the monarchy that can move forward without fracturing public confidence. And that makes her not just a participant in this transformation, but its anchor. A stabilizing force placed carefully at the center of a shifting structure, but with every realignment comes resistance, even if it remains unspoken. Within the palace, lines are not drawn openly, they are felt. Subtle divisions begin to take shape, not through confrontation, but through proximity. Who is included? Who is consulted? Who is trusted? These quiet distinctions create internal factions, not necessarily defined by conflict, but by alignment. And as Catherine's influence grows, those alignments begin to shift in response. At the same time, a generational transition is beginning to reveal itself not through declarations, but through decisions like this one. The future of the monarchy is no longer something distant or abstract. It is being shaped in real time through choices that position certain figures at the forefront, while others begin to fade into the background. And while this process remains controlled, even calculated, it does not come without consequence, because every step forward inevitably leaves something or someone behind. Outside the palace, this transformation is being mirrored in public perception. Catherine's rise aligns with a growing sense of trust and approval, reinforcing the idea that this shift is not just internal, but also strategic in terms of image. The monarchy is not simply changing, it is being presented differently, carefully curated, intentionally balanced, a version of itself that can maintain tradition while quietly embracing a more modern, controlled identity. And yet, for all its precision, this transformation carries an undercurrent of uncertainty, because no matter how carefully power is repositioned, it remains deeply personal at its core. Behind every strategic move lies a human decision, a judgment call, a choice shaped not only by logic, but by emotion, loyalty, and perhaps even doubt. And those elements, unseen but deeply felt, are what ultimately determine whether such a transformation holds or begins to fracture. Yet beneath the surface of strategy and symbolism, something far more personal was unfolding, something rooted in loyalty, trust, and perhaps even doubt. Decisions like this are never just strategic, they're deeply personal. Behind closed doors, King Charles wasn't just weighing roles and responsibilities. He was weighing people, trust, loyalty, stability. And in that calculation, one name rose while another quietly fell away. But what caused that shift? And what did Charles see or fear that led him to draw such a clear line? Because beneath the structure of monarchy, beneath the formality and carefully maintained image, there exists something far more fragile, human judgment. And in moments like this, that judgment becomes everything. Charles was not simply assigning responsibility. He was deciding who could carry the emotional and symbolic weight of something that mattered deeply to him. Balmoral was never just land, it was memory, identity, and control intertwined, and placing it in someone's hands required more than confidence. It required certainty. Over time, that certainty appears to have shifted. Those closest to the inner workings began to notice subtle changes, not dramatic enough to raise alarm, but consistent enough to form a pattern. Advisory voices evolved. Conversations became more selective. The circle around Charles, once broader and more predictable, started to contract, and within that contraction, influence became more concentrated, more deliberate, more guarded. It wasn't about exclusion for the sake of it, it was about precision. About ensuring that the voices shaping critical decisions aligned with a very specific vision. And in that evolving dynamic, Catherine's presence became increasingly significant, not because she demanded space, but because she fit seamlessly into it. Her approach measured, composed, controlled, aligned with what Charles seemed to need most: stability without complication. She did not introduce uncertainty, she reduced it. And in a system where perception can be just as powerful as reality, that quality carries immense weight. At the same time, the emotional dimension of this decision cannot be ignored. Choosing one person over another, especially within such a closely connected structure, is never neutral. It reflects not only trust, but preference. Not only strategy, but feeling. And that is where the complexity deepens, because this was not simply a shift toward Catherine, it was, inevitably, a step away from Camilla, and that kind of movement, no matter how controlled, carries consequences that extend beyond the immediate decision. There are also indications that private conversations played a decisive role. Not public discussions, not formal meetings, but quiet exchanges, moments where concerns could be expressed without scrutiny, where doubts could surface without consequence. It is within these spaces that decisions like this are often shaped, where logic meets instinct, where long-term vision is weighed against present reality, and where, ultimately, choices are made that cannot be undone. For Charles, the priority appears clear: control. Not in a forceful sense, but in a stabilizing one. a desire to ensure that the future of the monarchy unfolds in a way that feels unified, predictable, and secure. And to achieve that, he has begun to rely on fewer voices, but the ones he trusts most. This narrow wing of influence is not accidental. It is intentional, a way of reducing uncertainty by tightening the circle around him. But in doing so, he has also created distance, and distance, even when subtle, has a way of revealing truths that words often conceal. It shows where trust is strongest, where confidence is placed, and where it is no longer as firm as it once was. And while these shifts remain hidden behind closed doors, their impact is already beginning to ripple outward, because decisions rooted in trust and emotion rarely stay contained. They shape actions, relationships, and ultimately, perception. And as those ripples spread, they carry with them a question that has yet to be fully answered. And while these decisions remained hidden from the public, the consequences were about to become impossible to ignore. At first, it was just whispers, quiet conversations behind closed doors, hushed tones in corridors. But whispers don't stay quiet for long. As news of the decision spread through the palace, reactions began to surface. Surprise, confusion, even disbelief. Because what had just happened wasn't just unexpected, it challenged everything insiders thought they understood about power inside the monarchy. The initial response was not explosive, but it was immediate. A shift in tone, a pause in routine. Subtle glances exchanged where certainty once lived. Those who had spent years navigating the predictable rhythms of palace life suddenly found themselves in unfamiliar territory. This was not the kind of change that had been anticipated, let alone prepared for, and that uncertainty began to ripple outward, touching every layer of the institution. For some, the confusion lay in the speed of it. Decisions of this magnitude were rarely executed without a trail, some indication, some gradual repositioning that allowed those within the system to adjust. But this had arrived fully formed, leaving little room for interpretation, and where clarity was absent, speculation quickly took its place. Conversations that once revolved around routine matters began to shift, circling back again and again to the same question. Why? Because beneath the surface, it was clear this wasn't just about Balmoral. The estate had become a symbol, a focal point through which a much larger question was being asked. If Catherine now held this level of influence, what did that mean for everyone else? And more specifically, what did it mean for Camilla? Her absence from the process was no longer just a detail, it had become the center of the conversation. In corridors and private offices, the tone began to change. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Interactions carried a new weight, words were chosen more carefully. Silences stretched just a little longer than before. It wasn't open tension, it was something quieter, more controlled, but no less significant. A collective awareness that something fundamental had shifted, even if no one was willing to define it out loud. At the same time, Catherine's new role began to draw increased attention. Not in a celebratory sense, but in a scrutinizing one. Every move, every decision, every subtle indication of how she would carry this responsibility became a point of interest. Because this was not just about her capability, it was about what her rise represented, a change in direction, a recalibration of trust, and possibly a glimpse into the future structure of power. For those within the palace, the uncertainty became its own kind of pressure. Without clear answers, interpretations multiplied. Some saw strategy, others sensed risk. A few began to question whether this marked the beginning of a broader transformation, one that might extend beyond a single decision and reshape roles across the entire institution. And once that possibility entered the conversation, it became impossible to ignore. What made the situation even more delicate was the absence of any official narrative to contain it. No explanation, no clarification. Just the decision itself, standing alone, forcing everyone to draw their own conclusions. And in an environment where perception is everything, those conclusions began to carry weight. They influenced behavior. They shaped interactions. They quietly altered the internal balance. And as these conversations expanded, they began to move beyond the inner circle. What started as whispers within the palace was now on the edge of something larger, something that could no longer be contained by silence alone. Because once a shift like this begins to surface, It doesn't remain hidden for long, but beyond palace walls, the world was watching, and their reaction would only add more pressure to an already fragile situation. When royal decisions become public, they stop being private, and this one was no exception. As the story emerged, it ignited debate, speculation, and intense scrutiny. Was this a strategic masterstroke, or a sign of deeper division? The public saw more than a management transfer, they saw a glimpse into the monarchy's future. And that future suddenly looked very different from what many expected. What began as quiet internal movement quickly transformed into a public narrative that refused to stay contained. The moment the decision surfaced, it took on a life of its own, interpreted, debated, and reshaped by voices far beyond palace walls. And with each passing reaction, the weight of the decision seemed to grow. Because in the public eye, this was never going to be just about Balmoral. It became a symbol of change, of direction, of something shifting at the very core. Of the monarchy. For many, Catherine's rise felt like confirmation of an evolution already underway. Her presence, long associated with stability and composure, now appeared to represent something larger, a future that felt more aligned with public expectation, a monarchy that could adapt without appearing fractured. And in that sense, the decision was not just accepted by many, it was understood as inevitable. A natural progression towards something more controlled, more balanced, more in tune with the times, but not all interpretations were so seamless. Alongside that acceptance came a current of uneasy questions that lingered beneath the surface of approval. What did this mean for Camilla? Not just in terms of role, but in terms of relevance. Her absence from such a significant decision did not go unnoticed, and for many observers, it raised concerns that could not be easily dismissed. Because when influence appears to shift so clearly, it invites speculation about what else might be changing behind the scenes. The media, as expected, amplified every angle. Some framed the move as a bold strategic decision, evidence of careful planning and forward thinking. Others leaned into the tension, highlighting the contrast between Catherine's rise and Camilla's exclusion. Headlines began to shape perception, turning a private decision into a public turning point. And as those narratives spread, they began to define how the story was understood, not just by insiders, but by the world at large. At the heart of it all was a deeper debate, one that has followed the monarchy for years. Tradition versus modernization, continuity versus change. This decision seemed to sit directly at that intersection, forcing people to confront what they believed the monarchy should be. Should it remain anchored in established roles and expectations, or should it evolve, even if that evolution disrupts long-standing assumptions? And as that debate intensified, so did the pressure, because perception is not passive, it shapes reality. The way this decision was received began to influence how future decisions would be viewed. It raised expectations, it created anticipation, it placed Catherine in a position where every move would now be watched, not just as an individual action, but as part of a larger narrative about the monarchy's direction. And at the same time, it left Camilla in a space defined by uncertainty, where silence invites interpretation and absence invites conclusion. What this moment ultimately revealed was not just a shift in responsibility, but a shift in identity. The monarchy was no longer being seen as fixed, it was being understood as something in motion, something capable of redefining itself, even if that process came with tension and unanswered questions. And as the public continued to watch, analyze, and react, one thing became increasingly clear: this was not a moment that would simply pass. It was a turning point, a signal, a glimpse into what lies ahead. Because in the end, this wasn't just about Balmoral, it was about who holds power, who is trusted, and who is quietly being left behind. Some decisions echo quietly. Others redefine everything. This was the latter. What began as a private transfer of responsibility had evolved into something far more significant, a moment that revealed the monarchy's shifting core. And while the full consequences are still unfolding, one truth has become impossible to ignore. The balance of power has changed, and it may never return to what it once was. What started as a controlled, almost invisible adjustment has now settled into something far more permanent, a turning point that cannot be undone. The Balmoral decision no longer feels like an isolated act. It has become a marker in time, a dividing line between what the monarchy was and what it is quietly becoming. And in that shift, Catherine is no longer simply rising, she is being positioned, anchored into a role that now stretches beyond the present moment and extends deep into the future of the institution itself. That future, however, is not without tension, because while Catherine's influence solidifies, Camilla's absence remains unresolved. It lingers in the background of every interpretation, every reaction, every attempt to make sense of what has happened. There has been no clear resolution, no visible reconciliation of roles, only a quiet gap that continues to raise questions. And those questions do not fade easily, they persist, shaping how this decision is understood, how it is remembered, and how it will ultimately be judged. At the center of it all stands Charles, no longer just a figure navigating tradition, but one actively shaping its transformation. His choices now carry a different kind of weight, not reactive but defining. Each decision contributes to a legacy that is still being written, one that will be measured not only by stability, but by the direction he chose to take when faced with moments like this. And this moment, more than most, reveals a willingness to act decisively, even if that decisively leaves complexity in its wake. What emerges is a monarchy entering unfamiliar territory, not unstable but uncertain, not fractured but undeniably shifting. Power, once distributed through a broader network of influence, now feels more concentrated, more deliberate, more controlled. And while that control may offer clarity in the short term, it also raises a deeper question: what happens when so much rests on so few? Because every shift in power carries consequence. Some are immediate, others unfold slow, revealing their impact over time. And right now, the monarchy stands at the beginning of that unfolding. The effects of this decision are still taking shape, still moving through relationships, through perception, through the quiet spaces where real change is felt long before it is fully understood. There is also something else, something less defined, but no less important. A sense that this moment has set a precedent, that future decisions may follow a similar pattern, quiet, precise, unapologetic. And if that is the case, then what has happened here is not the exception, it is the beginning of a new way forward. And yet, despite all the analysis, all the interpretation, one element remains unresolved: the human side of it. The emotions that are never publicly acknowledged, but are always present. The quiet weight of exclusion, the quiet burden of expectation, the quiet realization that in moments like this, roles are not just assigned, they are taken, shifted, redefined, and as everything begins to settle into place, one truth continues to echo beneath the surface: this story is not over. It is still unfolding, still evolving, still carrying questions that have yet to be answered. And as the dust settles, one question continues to linger in the shadows: was this the beginning of unity, or the first visible crack in something far more fragile? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.